Blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes it just means you bleed the exact same way. Nora learned this sitting in a cracked leather booth that smelled of stale gin and pity, listening to her twin sister snicker from 2 tables away. It was supposed to be a joke, a humiliated, poorly dressed punchline. But punchlines change rapidly when a man with knuckles scarred from actual violence takes the empty seat opposite you. He didn't just ruin the cruel joke, he erased the laugh track completely. Neon light from the restaurant's exterior sign bled through the rain-streaked window, painting Nora's tightly clasped hands a bruised, flickering purple. She sat at a small, wobbly two-top near the back of Giovanni's, a mid-tier Italian place that tried to mask its cheap linoleum floors with low lighting and the overwhelming stench of roasted garlic. A sticky patch of varnish clung to the underside of her forearm. She tried to subtly peel her skin away, but the quiet, tearing sound only made her wince. Everything about tonight was uncomfortable. Everything was a mistake. She tugged at the neckline of the Chartreuse dress her twin sister, Nina, had graciously lent her for this blind date. Chartreuse, a color that made Nina's olive skin glow, but made Nora's identical complexion look jaundiced, sickly under the restaurant's dim bulbs. The fabric was cheap, synthetic, and pinched viciously at her armpits. It was a deliberate sabotage, like everything Nina did, wrapped up in the guise of sisterly charity. Nora checked her watch. The cracked leather strap felt rough against her wrist. 8:15. The date had been set for 7:30. She swallowed hard, the dry air in the restaurant scratching at her throat. She shouldn't have come. She knew it the moment Nina offered the setup, her perfectly manicured hand resting casually over the unpaid hospital bills stacked on their kitchen counter. Just go, Nora. Put yourself out there. If you do this one little favor for me, I'll take care of Mum's physical therapy this month. A transaction. Nora had sold her dignity for 3 sessions of a licensed professional, bending their mother's stroke-stiffened limbs. It was a desperate bargain, and sitting here in the garlic-soaked air, she felt the full, humiliating weight of it. Laughter cut through the low hum of dining patrons. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was the distinct, sharp, nasal snort of her twin sister. Nora didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. Above the bar, an angled mirror reflected the front half of the room. By shifting her eyes just a fraction, Nora saw them. Nina sat in a curved booth, flanked by 3 of her sycophantic friends, a half-empty martini glass dangling loosely from her fingers. Nina was looking directly at Nora's reflection in the mirror, whispering something to the man beside her. The whole booth erupted in another bout of muffled snickering. There was no blind date. The realization didn't hit Nora like a sudden blow. It seeped into her chest like cold, dirty water. The guy wasn't just late. He didn't exist. Or worse, he was someone Nina had paid to stand her up. This was the show. Nora was the evening's entertainment. She bit the inside of her cheek until the sharp, metallic tang of copper flooded her mouth. A hot prickle of sweat broke out along her hairline. She wanted to stand up, push the wobbly table over, and walk out into the freezing rain. But leaving meant Nina won. Leaving meant acknowledging the joke. If she stayed, if she just sat here and ordered a plate of cheap pasta, she could pretend she didn't care. A young waiter, looking deeply apologetic and avoiding her eyes, approached the table. He set down a tall glass filled with violently red liquid and a maraschino cherry. "I didn't order this," Nora said, her voice sounding raspy, foreign to her own ears. The waiter swallowed, shifting his weight. It's a Shirley Temple, miss, from the lady in the red dress at the bar. She said to tell you." He hesitated, his face flushing violently. "Tell me what?" Nora asked, staring at the condensation dripping down the side of the childish glass. She said to tell you that since you've got the palate of a 12-year-old, you might as well drink like one. Behind the waiter, the volume of laughter from Nina's booth spiked. They were watching, waiting for the reaction, waiting for the tears. Nora looked up at the waiter. His eyes were full of a suffocating, unbearable pity. That was worse than the laughter. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, wrapping her fingers around the icy glass. "You can keep the tab open." The waiter nodded quickly and retreated, practically fleeing the blast radius of her humiliation. Nora sat perfectly still. She focused on the cold glass, letting the freezing temperature ground her. Don't cry. Don't give her the satisfaction. Her chest felt tight, bound by iron bands, as the minutes dragged on. The joke had landed. Now she just had to survive the aftermath. 30 agonizing minutes passed. The ice in the Shirley Temple melted, turning the bright red syrup into a watered-down, sickly pink puddle. Nora stared at it, her mind blanking out the restaurant noise, trying to calculate how much a cab home in the rain would cost her. A heavy thump jolted her out of her math. The chair opposite her, the one meant for the fictional blind date, scraped harshly against the linoleum. Before Nora could process the movement, a man sat down. He didn't slide into the seat. He dropped into it with a weary, grounded finality, as if he had been walking for days. Nora blinked, her brain misfiring. She expected the punchline. She expected a greasy, hired actor in a joke costume, or maybe one of Nina's awful frat boy friends holding a hidden camera. The man sitting across from her was none of those things. He was wearing a dark, heavy wool overcoat, the shoulders damp from the rain outside. He smelled of wet asphalt, cold ozone, and the faint, bitter scent of black tobacco. He didn't look at her. Instead, he casually unbuttoned his coat, revealing a charcoal suit underneath that looked meticulously tailored, but rumpled from wear. He reached across the table, his movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the small, wax-coated menu. Nora stared. Her pulse gave a dull, confused thud against her collarbone. She took in the details of him in jagged fragments, the silver flecks in his dark hair, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of chronic, bone-deep exhaustion, and a thin, white scar that cut vertically through his left eyebrow. His hands, holding the menu, were entirely wrong for the expensive suit. The knuckles were swollen, thick with calluses, and dusted with faint, fading purple bruises. "You're at the wrong table," Nora said. Her voice came out flat, defensive. The man didn't lower the menu, he just shifted his eyes over the top edge. They were a dull, flat grey, like the surface of a frozen lake, impenetrable and totally devoid of warmth. "Am I?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, carrying a slight rasp, as if he rarely used it for pleasant conversation. "Yes," Nora said, her fingers tightening around her glass. She glanced toward the mirror. Nina and her friends had stopped laughing. They were staring, confused, their heads clustered together like agitated pigeons. "If she hired you to drag this out, you can tell her the joke is over. I'm not playing." The man lowered the menu slowly. The wax paper made a soft, crinkling sound in the quiet space between them. He rested his forearms on the table, the sleeves of his coat pulled back just enough to reveal the edge of a heavy, steel-faced watch. "Who hired me?" he asked. There was no inflection in his voice, no curiosity, just a flat demand for data. Nora gestured sharply with her chin toward the bar. "My sister, the one in the red dress, currently staring a hole into the back of your head." The man didn't turn around. He didn't even shift his gaze from Nora's face. He just stared at her, assessing her. It wasn't a sexual look. It wasn't friendly, either. It was the sterile, calculating gaze of an appraiser looking at a piece of machinery, trying to figure out if it was broken or just cheap. "I don't know anyone in a red dress," he said quietly. He picked up a fork from the napkin roll, inspecting the tines. "And nobody hires me for anything. I just wanted a table in the back, away from the windows." Nora's brow furrowed. The sheer, immovable mass of him was throwing her off balance. "The place is half empty. Pick another table." "I like this one," he stated. He set the fork down. "It's out of the draft." "I'm sitting here," I noticed. He finally looked fully at her face, his grey eyes catching the flickering neon light from the window. "You look like you're attending a funeral for someone you didn't particularly like." The bluntness of it knocked the air out of her. A small, involuntary sound, a half laugh, half scoff, escaped her throat. "I was stood up," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. "It was a setup, a prank. Now, if you don't mind, I was just about to leave." She reached for her cheap clutch on the table. Before her fingers could brush the faux leather, his hand moved. He didn't grab her wrist. He simply placed two of his thick, bruised fingers on top of her clutch, pinning it to the table. The movement was lightning fast, yet completely casual. Nora froze. The air around the table suddenly felt incredibly thin. "It's raining," he said, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. "And the veal here is supposed to be passable. Stay." It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. Nora looked at his fingers pressing into her bag, then up to his face. Every survival instinct she had honed over years of living on a tightrope was screaming at her to yank her bag away and run. This man wasn't normal. The quiet violence practically rolled off his damp coat, but beneath the terror, a strange, cynical rebellion flared in her chest. If she left now, Nina would see her running from a stranger. If she stayed... Nina's joke was officially ruined. Slowly, Nora pulled her hand back, leaving the clutch under his fingers. The man watched her withdraw, a microscopic shift in his jaw, the only sign he registered her compliance. He pulled his hand back, resting it on the table. "Vincent," he said, picking up the menu again. "Nora," she replied, her voice shaky but present. Vincent didn't offer a pleasantry. He just nodded once at the menu. "Don't order the seafood, Nora. We're 300 miles from the coast." Footsteps clicked sharply against the linoleum. It was a fast, aggressive rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. It sounded like a metronome ticking down to an inevitable disaster. Nora knew that walk. It was the sound of Nina losing control of the narrative and coming over to forcibly reclaim it. Nora's stomach plummeted. She instinctively curled her shoulders inward, bracing for the impact. Vincent didn't look up from his menu. He seemed entirely absorbed in the pathetic wine list. Nina arrived at the table like a localized weather event. She slapped her hand down on the edge of the wood, the heavy gold rings on her fingers clattering against the surface. The smell of cheap gin, sour citrus, and overpowering jasmine perfume washed over the table, entirely masking the scent of Vincent's wet wool coat. "Well, well, well," Nina slurred slightly, her eyes glittering with a toxic mix of alcohol and malice. "Look what the cat dragged in. Or should I say, look what Nora had to pull off the street." Nora felt the heat of deep, paralyzing embarrassment flush up her neck. She stared at her water glass, praying for the floor to open and swallow her. "Nina, please, just go back to the bar." "Go back?" Nina scoffed, leaning her weight onto the table. It wobbled precariously. "I'm just checking on my little sister's date. I didn't realize you were so desperate you started picking up drifters. How much do you charge by the hour, buddy? Because knowing Nora, she definitely can't afford your premium rate." Vincent slowly closed the menu. He didn't slam it. He just let the heavy wax cover fall shut with a flat, dull smack. He didn't look at Nina immediately. He took a moment to adjust the cuff of his shirt, pulling it down over his thick wrist. Then he turned his head. He looked at Nina with the exact same dead-eyed appraisal he had given Nora, but this time the temperature in his gaze was absolute 0. He didn't see a glamorous woman in a red dress. He looked at her as if she were a stain on the upholstery. "You're blocking my light," Vincent said softly. Nina blinked, momentarily thrown by the utter lack of reaction. She was used to men either fawning over her or getting defensive. This flat wall of indifference irritated her instantly. "Excuse me? Do you have any idea who you're talking to, you greasy—" The sound of chairs scraping abruptly cut her off. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the ambient hum of the restaurant, it was distinct. 2 tables over. 2 men in unremarkable grey suits pushed their chairs back from their half-eaten steaks. They didn't stand up. They just shifted their weight, their eyes locking onto Nina with terrifying synchronization. Nora hadn't even noticed them. They looked like accountants, blending perfectly into the drab wallpaper. But the way they moved, efficient, coiled, predatory, made the hair on Nora's arms stand up. Vincent didn't look at the men. He just raised the index finger of his right hand, barely an inch off the table. The 2 men instantly stopped moving. They remained seated, frozen, their eyes still burning into the side of Nina's head. Vincent shifted his attention back to Nina, who was suddenly looking around, confusion piercing through her drunken haze. "I know exactly what you are," Vincent said. His voice was a rasping whisper, forcing Nina to lean in slightly to hear her own destruction. "You are a loud, cheap distraction in a room where I require quiet." Nina's mouth opened, a retort forming on her glossy lips, but the words died in her throat as Vincent leaned forward just a fraction of an inch. "Walk back to the bar," he instructed, his tone conversational, but laced with a heavy, metallic finality. "Pay your tab. Leave the building. If I hear your voice again tonight, or if you ever stand over a table I am sitting at, I will have someone drag you into the alley and remove your tongue. Do you understand?" He didn't sound angry. It wasn't a boast. It was delivered with the absolute, bored certainty of a man reading the daily weather forecast. It was a simple statement of fact. "It is raining outside, and I will ruin you." Nina froze. The color drained from her face so rapidly her spray tan looked suddenly grotesque against her sickly, pale skin. Her eyes darted from Vincent's heavily scarred knuckles to the terrifyingly calm men 2 tables over, and finally to the expensive, bespoke cut of his dark suit. Recognition, or at least the primal, animal instinct of recognizing an apex predator, finally broke through the djinn. Nora watched in stunned silence as her twin sister physically recoiled. Nina took a step back, her high heel catching slightly on the linoleum. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at Nora. She turned on her heel and practically jogged back to the bar. Nora watched in the mirror as Nina grabbed her coat off the stool, throwing cash wildly onto the counter. Her friends, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in their leader's demeanor, scrambled after her like frightened sheep. Within 30 seconds the front door jingled, and they were gone, swallowed by the rainy night. The restaurant, previously buzzing with low chatter, had gone dead silent. The few patrons who had witnessed the exchange were aggressively staring at their plates, terrified to make eye contact. The waiter who had delivered the Shirley Temple was hiding behind the POS station. Nora sat frozen. Her hands were shaking. A cold, clammy sweat had broken out across her collarbone. She wasn't swooning over a rescue. She was terrified. She looked at the man sitting across from her, realizing with absolute clarity that she had traded a humiliating joke for something infinitely more dangerous. Vincent ignored the suffocating silence of the room. He picked the menu back up, opening it with a soft crinkle. "So," he murmured, his eyes scanning the entrees. "The veal. Panic tastes exactly like old pennies and stomach acid." Nora chewed a piece of rubbery calamari, her jaw mechanical, entirely unable to swallow. Across the small, wobbly table, Vincent sliced his veal with the muted, terrifying precision of a surgeon. His knife never once scraped the ceramic plate. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace that commanded the space around him, shrinking the rest of the restaurant down to background noise. Nobody in Giovanni's was speaking above a hushed, breathy whisper. The ambient soundtrack of clinking glasses and boisterous laughter had been suffocated. Patrons kept their eyes glued to their lukewarm pasta, acutely aware of the two grey-suited men who remained seated a few tables away, drinking black coffee and watching the room with the casual vigilance of prison guards. Nora finally forced the calamari down. It sat in her stomach like a lead weight. She looked at her own plate, a massive, unappetizing mound of spaghetti carbonara that the terrified waiter had practically dropped onto the table before fleeing. The sauce had begun to congeal, forming a thick, yellow skin over the pasta. "You're shaking," Vincent said. He didn't look up from his meal. "I'm freezing," Nora replied. Her voice cracked slightly. It was a pathetic lie. The cheap chartreuse fabric of her dress was thin, yes, but the sweat pooling at the base of her spine was purely hot, primal fear. Vincent paused. He rested his heavy forearms on the edge of the table, the silver steel of his watch catching the dim overhead light. He finally lifted his gaze. Those flat, grey eyes pinned her to her cheap wooden chair. "You're terrified," he corrected, his tone devoid of gloating. It was merely an observation of a physical fact, like noting the rain outside. "Your heart rate is visible against the pulse point in your neck. Your breathing is shallow. You've held your fork in your left hand for 12 minutes without taking a bite." Nora slowly lowered the fork, letting it clatter softly against the rim of her bowl. "You just threatened to have my sister's tongue cut out in a crowded restaurant, and nobody called the police. Forgive me if my appetite is slightly compromised." A microscopic shift occurred in Vincent's jaw. It wasn't quite a smile. It lacked entirely the warmth required for such a thing. But it was a recognition, an acknowledgement of a direct hit. "She was giving you a migraine," Vincent said quietly. He took a sip of his water. "And she was giving me one. I solved the problem." "You escalated the problem to a felony," Nora shot back, the exhaustion of the evening suddenly overriding her survival instincts. She rubbed her temples, her fingers pressing into the pulsing ache behind her eyes. "She's going to go home, sober up, and realize what just happened. Then she's going to make my life a living hell for embarrassing her. That's how this works. You didn't solve anything. You just changed the venue of my punishment." Vincent set his glass down. The condensation pooled on the varnished wood. "Why'd you let her humiliate you in the first place? You knew it was a trap before I sat down. You saw her in the mirror. I watched you see her." Nora stiffened. He had been watching her before he approached the table. The thought made the hairs on her arms stand up. She looked away, staring at the neon sign buzzing weakly in the window. "It's none of your business. You stayed," Vincent pressed, his voice dropping an octave, slipping beneath the ambient noise of the room to reach only her. "A woman who values her pride walks out. A woman who stays when she knows she's the punchline is either a masochist or she's being paid. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys pain." You flinch too easily. The clinical accuracy of his assessment stripped her bare. Anger, hot and bright, finally pierced through the icy terror in her chest. She leaned forward, ignoring the way her cheap dress dug into her ribs. I stayed because my mother's left side is paralyzed from a stroke, and her insurance capped her physical therapy last Tuesday, Nora said, her words clipping out fast and sharp. My sister, the one you just terrified out of the building, controls the trust fund my father left behind. She offered to pay for 3 sessions if I came here tonight, and wore this hideous dress so she and her friends could laugh at me. So yes, I am being paid. In bodily mobility for a woman who can't hold a spoon. She stopped, her chest heaving slightly, instantly regretting the outburst. She didn't want his pity. She expected him to look uncomfortable, to offer a hollow apology, or to suddenly find his veal intensely interesting. Vincent did none of those things. His expression remained completely unchanged. The flat grey lakes of his eyes simply absorbed the information, filing it away. He didn't offer a platitude about her mother. He didn't judge the transaction. 3 sessions, Vincent repeated, for a public execution of your dignity. It's the going rate, Nora said bitterly, picking up her fork again just to have something to hold on to. It's a terrible rate, Vincent corrected softly. He picked up his napkin, wiping his mouth with slow, deliberate care. You sold yourself incredibly cheap, Nora. If you're going to let someone put a price tag on your humiliation, you make sure it bankrupts them. He threw the linen napkin onto his empty plate. He didn't ask for the check. He didn't gesture to the waiter. He simply stood up. The movement displaced the air around the table, pulling Nora's attention entirely upward. He towered over her, the heavy wool of his dark suit absorbing the weak light of the restaurant. Come on, he said. Nora blinked, her grip tightening on her fork. Excuse me. Dinner is over. The food was abysmal. I'm taking you home. Protesting felt entirely useless, like arguing with a descending elevator. Nora stood up, her legs feeling like hollowed-out birchwood. She reached for her cheap faux leather clutch, her fingers numb. By the time she slung the strap over her shoulder, Vincent was already walking toward the front door. He didn't check to see if she was following. He operated on the absolute, terrifying assumption of compliance. As they passed the bar, Nora saw the 2 grey-suited men seamlessly fold themselves into the wake of Vincent's path. They didn't rush. They moved with the synchronized fluidity of water flowing around a rock. A leather binder containing the check sat on the host's stand. Vincent didn't open it. He pulled a thick, silver money clip from his interior pocket, detached a few crisp, dark green bills with one thumb, and dropped them onto the leather. It was enough cash to buy the table they had eaten at. The host, a pimply teenager who looked like he was bordering on tachycardia, didn't even breathe as they walked past. Vincent pushed the heavy glass door open, stepping out into the brutal, freezing downpour. The air outside was shocking. It smelled of wet asphalt, rotting trash from the alleyway, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The rain was coming down in sheets, bouncing violently off the flooded pavement. Nora hesitated under the small canvas awning of the restaurant, shivering violently as the damp chill instantly sank its teeth into the thin chartreuse fabric of her dress. A massive armored black SUV idled at the curb. It looked less like a car and more like a military transport vehicle that had been painted for a funeral. The engine gave off a deep, guttural purr that vibrated through the soles of Nora's cheap heels. The passenger side door opened from the inside before Vincent even reached the curb. A man in a dark raincoat stepped out, holding an enormous black umbrella over the open door, his eyes scanning the empty street with robotic efficiency. Vincent stopped at the edge of the awning and looked back at Nora. She was hugging her arms to her chest, her teeth clicking together uncontrollably. "I can take the bus," Nora said. Her voice was barely audible over the roaring rain. She pointed vaguely down the street toward a dark, flooded shelter. "It's just 4 stops, really. Thank you for dinner. The buses on this route stopped running 20 minutes ago due to the localized flooding on 4th Street, Vincent replied, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the storm. He didn't raise his voice, but she heard him perfectly. "Then I'll call a cab." Vincent looked down the desolate, flooded avenue. There wasn't a single set of headlights in either direction. The city felt entirely abandoned, washed out by the storm. He turned his eyes back to her. He didn't look annoyed. He looked entirely indifferent to her stubbornness. "You will freeze to death waiting for a cab that isn't coming to this neighborhood," Vincent stated. "Get in the car, Nora." It wasn't a threat. It was the heavy, crushing weight of reality. Her shoes were already soaking wet from the puddle under the awning. Her toes were numb. Her phone battery was at 12%, and she barely had enough in her checking account to cover the overdraft fee, let alone surge pricing for a ride share. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had already established that tonight. Nora ducked her head, stepped out from under the awning, and practically ran the 3 steps to the SUV. The man holding the umbrella shielded her as she climbed up into the cavernous interior, the heavy armored door slamming shut behind her with a definitive, airtight thud. The sound of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a soft, distant drumming against the thick, bullet-resistant glass. The interior of the SUV smelled heavily of rich, conditioned leather, expensive sandalwood cologne, and beneath it all, the faint, sharp scent of gun oil. The heat was blasting, wrapping around her freezing skin like a physical blanket. Nora sank back into the deep captain's chair, her muscles involuntarily unlocking as the warmth penetrated her damp clothes. The opposite door opened, letting in a brief rush of cold air and rain before Vincent climbed inside. He settled into the seat next to her, pulling his damp wool overcoat off and tossing it casually into the 3rd row. He was wearing a charcoal vest over a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his scarred, heavy forearms. He didn't look at her. He tapped a glass partition, separating them from the driver. "Donovan," Vincent said quietly. "Take us to—" He paused, finally turning his head to look at Nora. "Fremont Street," Nora mumbled, staring at her wet knees. "South End, near the overpass." Vincent didn't react to the address, even though everyone in the city knew the South End of Fremont was a rotting grid of decaying tenements and petty crime. He just tapped the glass again. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding over the flooded potholes as if they didn't exist. The ride was agonizingly silent. Nora sat as still as possible, clutching her faux leather bag in her lap. The contrast between her reality and the vehicle she was sitting in was dizzying. The leather beneath her thighs cost more than her mother's annual rent. The tinted windows hid her from the miserable, rain-soaked city she trudged through every day. For a brief, terrifying moment, she felt completely untethered from her own life. The SUV took a sharp, aggressive right turn to bypass a stalled delivery truck. The sudden centrifugal force threw Nora slightly sideways. She braced herself against the center console, but her cheap clutch, the one with the broken brass clasp she kept forgetting to superglue, popped open. Its contents spilled onto the immaculate black floor mats. A tube of dried-out drugstore lipstick, a ring of brass keys attached to a frayed lanyard, and 3 pieces of heavily folded, brightly colored paper. Nora gasped, scrambling forward to gather her life off the floorboards. Her fingers scrambled frantically, snagging the lipstick and the keys. She reached for the papers, but a large, scarred hand beat her to it. Vincent leaned down effortlessly, his thick fingers plucking the 3 folded sheets from the floor mat. "Don't," Nora whispered, a fresh wave of hot humiliation rushing up her neck. "Please give those back." Vincent didn't hand them back. He sat up, the papers resting lightly in his palm. He didn't unfold them. He didn't need to. The bold, aggressive red lettering of "Final Notice" was stamped clearly on the exterior fold of the top sheet, right above the logo for St. Jude's Neurological Rehabilitation Center. He stared at the red ink for a long, quiet moment. The only sound in the car was the rhythmic, hypnotic sweeping of the windshield wipers. Nora stopped reaching. She sat back in her seat, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, feeling completely exposed. It was one thing to tell a stranger you were broke. It was another thing to have the physical, damning evidence of your failure resting in his violent, capable hands. "St. Jude's," Vincent read aloud, his voice low, lacking any inflection of pity. "They run a good facility, state-of-the-art hydrotherapy." "I know what they have," Nora snapped, staring out the window at the blurry streetlights. "I just can't afford it. Hence the chartreuse dress and the blind date." "Now can I please have my mail back?" Vincent slowly extended his hand. Nora snatched the bills from his fingers, shoving them brutally back into her broken clutch. She held the bag tight against her stomach, a physical barrier between her and the suffocating reality of the car. "How far behind are you?" Vincent asked. He was staring at the glass partition, his profile illuminated by passing street lamps. "It doesn't matter. It's a simple mathematical question, Nora. How far behind are you?" 4 months, she lied. It was 6. Vincent didn't press her. He merely rested his head back against the leather headrest, closing his eyes. The exhaustion in his face seemed to deepen in the shadows, pulling down the corners of his mouth. He looked like a man who carried the weight of a crumbling empire on his back. 10 minutes later, the SUV slowed to a crawl. They were on Fremont Street. The transition was stark. The streetlights here were either shattered or flickering violently. Trash choked the gutters. The rain battered against the corrugated metal roofs of the abandoned storefronts. Donovan pulled the massive vehicle to a stop outside Nora's building, a 5-story block of decaying grey brick with a fire escape clinging desperately to the front facade. The porch light above the heavy security door was completely burned out. The engine idled, a low, menacing rumble in the quiet, impoverished street. Nora didn't wait for the man with the umbrella this time. She grabbed her clutch, her knuckles turning white. She turned to the man sitting next to her. He still had his eyes closed. "Thank you for the ride," Nora said softly. Her voice sounded thin, frail against the heavy armor of his world. "And for intervening at the restaurant. You didn't have to." Vincent opened his eyes. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The flat grey of his irises caught the dim light from a passing car. "Get inside, Nora. Lock your deadbolt." He didn't say goodbye. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't offer a patronizing promise that things would get better. He just gave her a survival instruction. Nora swallowed hard. She pushed the heavy door open, throwing her weight against it, and stepped out into the freezing rain. She slammed the door shut, the airtight seal cutting off the warmth and the smell of sandalwood instantly. She ran up the cracked concrete steps, her cheap heels slipping dangerously on the wet surface. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking violently from the cold, and managed to jam the brass key into the rusted lock of the security door. Before she pulled it open, she looked back. The black SUV hadn't moved. It sat at the curb, an immovable, terrifying monolith in the pouring rain. Its headlights were off, but she could feel the weight of the occupants inside, watching her, ensuring she crossed the threshold. Nora pulled the heavy door open, slipped inside the damp, mildew-scented lobby of her building, and let the door slam shut behind her. The lock clicked into place with a heavy metallic thud. She stood in the dark, shivering uncontrollably, her wet clothes clinging to her skin. She was safe in her miserable, familiar reality. The joke was over. The night was done. But as she began the long, agonizing climb up 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, her broken clutch pressed tightly against her ribs, Nora couldn't shake the terrifying, absolute certainty that her life had just violently, irrevocably changed course. Morning broke like a fractured bone, grey, reluctant, and full of a dull, throbbing ache. Nora woke up on her sagging thrift store sofa, her neck cramped at a vicious angle. The thin, synthetic blanket she had pulled over herself sometime around 3 a.m. had slipped onto the floor, offering zero protection against the damp chill radiating from the single, drafty window. She lay there for a long minute, staring at the familiar water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a bruised lung. Her cheap chartreuse dress hung over the back of a dining chair, a crumpled, ugly reminder of the previous night. She closed her eyes, the events playing back in jagged, terrifying flashes, the smell of cheap gin on Nina's breath, the flat, dead eyes of the man named Vincent, the agonizing silence of the black SUV, the final, horrifying sight of the heavily armored vehicle idling outside her decaying apartment building in the pouring rain. Nora shoved herself off the sofa, her joints popping in protest. She walked into the tiny, narrow kitchen. It smelled faintly of old cooking grease and the harsh bleach she used to scrub the cracked linoleum. She turned on the faucet, letting the rusty water run clear before filling a battered kettle. The reality of daylight made the terror of the previous night feel slightly less suffocating, replacing it with a far more familiar, grinding anxiety. Today was Tuesday. Tuesday meant the clinic. Tuesday meant begging. By 8 o'clock, Nora had wrestled her mother, Diane, into her wheelchair. It was a grueling, violently unglamorous process. Since the stroke, Diane's left side was dead weight. Nora had to brace her knees, wrap her arms around her mother's waist, and heave, relying entirely on momentum and adrenaline. The scent of medicinal talcum powder, stale lavender soap, and the sour tang of unwashed hair clung to the air. Diane didn't speak much anymore, but her eyes, sharp and fiercely proud, conveyed a deep, humiliated apology every time Nora had to wipe a dribble of oatmeal from her chin. "We're going to see Dr. Evans today," Nora lied smoothly, adjusting the heavy wool blanket over her mother's lap. "He thinks you're making excellent progress." Diane gave a slow, asymmetrical blink. She knew it was a lie, and Nora knew she knew. The transit ride to St. Jude's Neurological Rehabilitation Center took 45 minutes. Nora stood in the articulated middle section of the city bus, gripping a rusted metal pole with white knuckles to keep the wheelchair from sliding on the wet rubber floor. The heater blasted dry, dusty air that smelled of melting plastic, doing nothing to warm her damp boots. St. Jude's was located in a starkly different zip code. The transition from rotting brick tenements to sleek, glass-fronted medical complexes was always jarring. Here, the sidewalks were swept, the air smelled cleaner, and the people walked with the brisk, upright confidence of the fully insured. Nora wheeled her mother through the sliding double doors. The lobby was an aggressive display of sanitized wealth. Faux marble floors, a massive saltwater aquarium humming quietly in the center, and the sharp, sterile scent of industrial antiseptic layered under expensive citrus air freshener. Nora parked Diane near the aquarium, murmuring a quiet promise to return in a minute. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her fraying wool coat, and marched toward the billing department. Mrs. Gable, the head of patient accounts, was a woman whose entire personality seemed constructed from starched collars and rigid deadlines. She usually looked at Nora with a mixture of profound exhaustion and thinly veiled contempt. Nora approached the frosted glass counter. Mrs. Gable, I'm here about Diane Reed's account. I know we're behind. I have $300 to put toward the arrears today. And if you just give me until Friday—" "Miss Reed," Mrs. Gable interrupted. Nora stopped. The administrator wasn't glaring at her. In fact, Mrs. Gable looked deeply uncomfortable. She was staring at her computer monitor, her manicured fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if the plastic keys were suddenly red hot. "I don't need $300, Miss Reed," Mrs. Gable said, her voice unusually subdued. Panic, icy and sharp, spiked in Nora's chest. "Are you discharging her? You can't! The state mandate says you have to give 30 days' notice before terminating a critical physical therapy protocol." "We aren't discharging her," Mrs. Gable said quickly, lowering her voice and glancing nervously toward the open door of the back office. She turned her monitor slightly so Nora could see the screen. Nora leaned in. The columns of numbers were familiar to her. They had haunted her nightmares for 6 months. The late fees, the compounding interest, the terrifying, ever-growing red number at the bottom right. But the screen wasn't red. It was a flat, sterile black. Account balance. 0.20 so. Prepaid credit. 45,000 less. Nora stopped breathing. The hum of the saltwater aquarium across the lobby suddenly sounded like a roaring waterfall. She stared at the screen, her brain violently rejecting the data. "There's been a mistake," Nora whispered. "That's not our account." "It is," Mrs. Gable confirmed, her tone stripped of its usual arrogance. "A wire transfer cleared at 6 a.m. this morning. It paid the arrears in full and pre-funded your mother's account for the next 24 months, including the premium hydrotherapy sessions." "Who?" Nora demanded, her hand slapping down on the counter. The glass was freezing against her palms. Mrs. Gable flinched. "It was routed through a corporate holding company. Crestwood Logistics. That's all the information the bank provided." The administrator leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Miss Reed, the man who called to confirm the routing numbers at 7 this morning, he didn't ask questions. He told my supervisor that if your mother's appointment was delayed by even a single minute today, he would buy the building and turn it into a parking garage." "Who did you involve in this?" Nora couldn't answer. Her tongue felt like dry leather. She turned away from the counter, her eyes blindly seeking her mother across the lobby. Diane was watching the colorful fish dart behind a piece of synthetic coral, completely unaware that her daughter had just been bought and paid for. This wasn't a gift. You don't drop $45,000 on a stranger because you felt bad they got stood up at a cheap Italian restaurant. This was a tether. A heavy iron chain forged in the span of a single car ride. Vincent had looked at her broken life, calculated the exact dollar amount required to own her gratitude, and wired it before she had even finished her morning coffee. Nora's stomach pitched violently. She grabbed the edge of a nearby leather waiting chair to steady herself. She didn't feel relieved. She felt hunted. Fear is a paralyzing agent, but humiliation is a profound, explosive fuel. Nora spent the next 3 hours sitting in a rigid plastic chair in the observation room, watching a licensed therapist gently manipulate her mother's paralyzed limbs in a heated pool. The water was a stunning, artificial blue. Diane looked more relaxed than she had in 6 months. Every time Nora looked at the warm water, she felt physically sick. She pulled out her phone. The battery was dying. The screen cracked in the bottom left corner. She typed Crestwood Logistics into the search bar. The results were sparse, which terrified her more than a laundry list of criminal indictments would have. It was a sterile, single-page corporate website. No names, no board of directors, just an address in the heavily industrial docklands on the far east side of the city, and a vague mission statement about supply chain optimization. By noon, Nora had wheeled her mother back to the apartment, settled her in front of the television with a cup of lukewarm tea, and locked the deadbolt behind her. She didn't change her clothes. She didn't want to look presentable. She kept her fraying wool coat buttoned to her chin, her wet boots squeaking against the linoleum of the bus floor as she headed east. The Docklands were a brutal, unforgiving stretch of the city. The air here tasted entirely different, thick with the metallic bite of salt off the harbour, diesel exhaust, and the sharp, acidic scent of rust. Massive shipping containers were stacked like grim, rusted Lego blocks against the bruised grey sky. The roads were deeply potholed, filled with oily, iridescent water. Nora walked the last 4 blocks from the bus stop. The wind coming off the water was vicious, biting through her coat and chilling the sweat that had broken out across her lower back. She found the address at the end of a dead-end street, flanked by abandoned warehouses. Crestwood Logistics didn't look like a holding company. It was a massive, brutalist concrete structure with no windows on the ground floor. A high, reinforced steel fence surrounded the perimeter. There was no sign, no welcoming lobby entrance, just a heavy security gate and a tiny, bulletproof glass booth. Nora walked up to the booth. A man inside, wearing a dark, tactical fleece, barely looked up from his monitor. "Deliveries go to the south gate," he grunted, his voice heavily distorted through the thick glass speaker. "I'm not a delivery," Nora said, forcing her voice to stay level, though her hands were trembling so violently she had to shove them deep into her coat pockets. "I'm here to see Vincent." The guard finally looked up. His eyes narrowed, taking in her cheap clothes, her wind-whipped hair, and the desperate, hollow look in her eyes. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell her to get lost. He reached for a black telephone receiver, mounted to the wall. He spoke quietly into it, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. A few seconds later, he hung up and pressed a heavy red button on his desk. The massive steel gate beside the booth gave a loud, hydraulic hiss and slowly slid open. "Door 3, straight ahead. Don't wander," the guard instructed flatly. Nora walked through this gate, feeling like she was stepping into the jaws of a very large, very quiet animal. The courtyard was immaculate. A dozen identical, heavily armored black SUVs were parked in a neat row against the far wall. The silence here was oppressive, unnatural for a working dockyard. She pulled open the heavy steel door marked "Threat." The interior was jarringly different from the brutalist exterior. It wasn't a warehouse. It was a massive, pristine auto-restoration garage. The floor was coated in a flawless, reflective grey epoxy. The air smelled intoxicatingly of high-grade motor oil, ozone from a welding torch, and the rich scent of worn leather. Classical music, something quiet and sorrowful with heavy cellos, played softly from high-end speakers mounted in the rafters. In the center of the vast space sat the stripped-down chassis of a vintage muscle car. And leaning over the engine block, wearing dark work trousers and a plain grey t-shirt stretched tight across his broad shoulders, was Vincent. He didn't have the suit on. His forearms, thick with muscle and corded veins, were smeared with black grease. The fading purple bruises on his knuckles stood out starkly against the dark oil. He didn't look up when the heavy door closed behind her. He continued carefully tightening a bolt with a long, silver wrench, his movements precise and entirely unhurried. 3 men in dark clothes, scattered around the periphery of the garage, instantly stopped what they were doing and stared at Nora. Their hands casually dropped toward their waistbands. "It's fine," Vincent said. His low, rasping voice carried perfectly over the cello music. He didn't look up from the engine. The 3 men immediately relaxed, turning their attention back to their respective tasks, though the air remained thick with their hypervigilance. Nora stood frozen just inside the door, the heat of the garage slowly thawing her frozen cheeks. She had prepared a speech on the bus ride over, a blistering, righteous monologue about boundaries and the audacity of his presumption. But looking at him now, at the sheer, terrifying physical reality of him in his own domain, the words evaporated in her throat. Vincent carefully placed the wrench on a pristine red microfiber towel resting on the fender. He picked up another towel and slowly wiped the thick grease from his hands. Only then did he turn to look at her. His grey eyes were exactly as she remembered them from the restaurant, flat, unreadable, and utterly devoid of warmth. He took in her soaked boots, the fraying hem of her coat, and the violent tremor in her jaw. "You found the address," Vincent murmured, tossing the soiled towel onto a workbench. He walked toward her, his heavy boots silent on the epoxy floor. He stopped 10 feet away, a deliberate buffer of space. "I assumed it would take you at least until tomorrow." "You paid St. Jude's," Nora said. Her voice cracked on the first syllable. She hated how weak she sounded. She cleared her throat, forcing a harder edge into her tone. $45,000. Vincent leaned back against a heavy metal tool cabinet, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yes." "Why?" "Your mother required physical therapy. The facility required capital. I provided the bridge between the two variables." He stated it with the bored detachment of an accountant explaining a tax bracket. "I didn't ask you for a bridge!" Nora snapped, stepping forward, the anger finally burning through her fear. "I didn't ask you for a dime. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you do, but I know what a $45,000 debt to a man who travels with armed guards means. I can't pay you back. I am aware of your financial illiquidity, Nora. I saw your bank statements." Nora stopped dead. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, painful rush. You looked at my bank accounts? I own the holding company that owns the server farm that processes data for your local credit union," Vincent explained calmly, his expression completely blank. "It took Donovan 4 minutes to aggregate your financial history. You have $72 to your name. Your sister controls your father's estate and disburses it solely at her discretion. You work 30 hours a week as a freelance transcriptionist because it allows you to stay home with your mother. You buy your groceries at a discount salvage store on Thursdays." Nora felt violently ill. The room spun slightly. She wasn't just poor, she was transparent. This man had dissected her entire miserable existence before she had even finished her morning coffee. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice shaking with a potent mix of rage and deep, profound shame. Vincent didn't flinch at her anger. He pushed off the tool cabinet and took 2 slow steps toward her, closing the distance until she could smell the motor oil and the sharp tang of his sweat. "Right is a concept for people who require permission," Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave, sliding beneath the melancholy notes of the cello. "I don't require permission. I require order. And watching you sit in a cheap restaurant, trading the last shred of your pride for a fraction of what your mother needs, was deeply disorderly." Nora stared up at him, her chest heaving. The sheer, immovable arrogance of his worldview was staggering. "You think you fixed it?" she demanded, tears of pure frustration finally pricking the corners of her eyes. She refused to let them fall. "You think throwing money at me makes my life orderly? You just chained me to a monster." "What happens when you decide you want repayment? What happens when you decide I owe you a favor? I don't have anything to give you." Vincent looked down at her. For the first time since she had met him, the flat, dead surface of his grey eyes rippled. A dark, intense pressure built behind his stare, pulling the air out of the space between them. He raised his hand. Nora instantly flinched, her shoulders curling inward, her eyes squeezing shut in anticipation of violence. It was a purely Pavlovian response, built from years of dealing with a cruel world. Vincent stopped. His hand hovered an inch from her face. The silence in the garage became absolute. Even the men working in the periphery seemed to stop breathing. "Open your eyes," Vincent commanded softly. Nora slowly opened them. Her heart was battering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Vincent was staring at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It wasn't anger. It looked terrifyingly like regret. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand until his rough, grease-stained fingers brushed against the fraying wool of her coat collar. He didn't touch her skin. He simply adjusted the collar, pulling it tighter against the cold air she had brought in with her. "You flinch," Vincent said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You flinch because you expect the world to strike you. You expect every transaction to end in a deficit." "Because it does," Nora whispered, staring at the scarred knuckles resting against her collarbone. "Not this one." Vincent dropped his hand, taking a half step back, though his physical presence still loomed over her like a thundercloud. "The debt is paid. There is no ledger. I don't want your $72. I don't want your gratitude. And I certainly don't want favors from a woman who wears a coat held together by safety pins." The insult stung, but it grounded her. It cut through the terrifying Mafia boss mystique and brought them back to harsh reality. "Then why?" Nora pushed, refusing to back down. "People like you don't do things for free. You said it yourself last night. You don't get hired. You don't do favors. So why me?" Vincent turned away from her, walking back to the workbench. He picked up a clean rag and began wiping down the silver wrench he had been using. He took a long time to answer. The rhythmic, metallic squeak of the rag against the steel was the only sound in the room. "My world is exceptionally loud, Nora," Vincent finally said, his back still turned to her. "It is filled with people who scream, people who lie, and people who take up oxygen they haven't earned. Your sister is one of them." She was a loud, grating noise in a room where I wanted silence. He set the wrench down carefully, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the metal bench. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. "You, on the other hand, are quiet," Vincent continued, his eyes locking onto hers with a heavy gravitational pull. "You took the humiliation. You swallowed the joke. You bled out on that table to protect someone else. And you didn't make a sound. I found the asymmetry of that situation highly offensive." Nora didn't know how to process that. He hadn't saved her out of kindness. He had saved her because her suffering violated his personal aesthetic of how the world should operate. It was a terrifyingly cold calculation, yet it yielded an impossibly warm result. "So I'm just a correction?" Nora asked, her voice tight. "A rounding error you fixed so you could eat your veal in peace." A dark, dangerous shadow passed over Vincent's face. He turned fully around, the heavy muscles in his jaw ticking. In 2 strides, he closed the distance between them again. This time, he didn't leave a buffer. He stopped inches from her, forcing Nora to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "If you were a rounding error, Nora, I would have had Donovan hand you $1,000 in cash at the curb and driven away," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. The smell of ozone and dark coffee surrounded her completely. "I wouldn't have wired $45,000 to a medical facility. I wouldn't have spent the last 12 hours running background checks on your sister. And I wouldn't be standing here right now, letting you scream at me in my own garage." Nora's breath hitched. She looked into his eyes and realized, with a sudden sinking horror, that the flat, grey surface was a lie. Beneath the dead-eyed stare was a violent, obsessive machinery that was currently actively turning its focus entirely onto her. "You came to my territory," Vincent murmured, his eyes dropping to her trembling lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. "You breached my perimeter to yell at me about a debt I explicitly told you didn't exist. You are brave, Nora. Incredibly, foolishly brave." He reached out again. This time he didn't stop at her collar. He pressed his heavy, calloused thumb against the soft skin of her jawline. His touch was shockingly warm, gentle despite the raw power contained in his hands. Nora froze, her pulse thundering against his thumb. Every alarm bell in her head was screaming to run, to sprint out of the heavy steel doors and never look back. But she couldn't move. The sheer gravity of the man anchored her to the floor. "Go home," Vincent ordered softly, his thumb tracing a microscopic line along her jaw before pulling away. "Take care of your mother. Buy a coat that actually retains heat. And do not ever come back here unless you are prepared to stay." He stepped past her, dismissing her with a brutal, absolute finality. Nora stood trembling in the center of the garage, the heat of his touch still burning into her skin. She turned and practically fled toward the door, pushing it open and stepping back out into the freezing, rain-slicked dockyard. As she walked blindly toward the bus stop, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Nora realized she had gone to Crestwood Logistics to free herself from a debt. Instead, she had just walked straight into a cage. Nora just learned the harshest lesson of the criminal underworld. Nothing is ever truly free, especially salvation. The hospital bill is zeroed out, but the personal ledger is wide open, and Vincent operates on his own brutal currency. If you felt that agonizing tension and want to see what happens when Nina inevitably stumbles back into his crosshairs, you have to stick around. Hit that like button to feed the algorithm. Share this video with anyone who secretly loves a gritty romance. And subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments if you think Vincent is a shield or just a brand new cage.